ethics of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric, from feedback to learner autonomy? We'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about English teaching and related matters. Today we bring you an interview with Sulaiman Jenkins. Sulaiman Jenkins is an academic scholar and a researcher in the field of applied linguistics. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, and having received his MA in TESOL from NYU, he has been teaching as an English lecturer in Saudi Arabia for over 16 years, holding a number of administrative positions. He has published articles in top-tier publications, and his research interests concern race, identity, and language. He has also written the book Life is Raw, a biographical memoir of Mutah Beale's life, a former member of the rap group Outlawz. He is currently a course coordinator and English lecturer for King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, and is currently pursuing doctoral studies on the issue of Native-speakerism. In this interview, recorded remotely, Rob asked questions to Sulaiman about Native-speakerism, cultural chauvinism, and other related topics. Okay, so we hope you enjoy this episode.
Okay, so this is Rob, and I'm here with Sulaiman Jenkins. Thanks very much for joining me.
Appreciate it. Glad to be on the show.
So just to begin with, could you give us a little background information about you, about your life, how you got involved in English teaching, and a little bit about your career to date?
Sure. I'm Sulaiman Jenkins. I'm from New York. I'm married, have kids, love to play basketball, love to read, love to write. So those are my sort of my basics. A very interesting story how I got involved in English language teaching. I was actually set up to work on Wall Street. I had an internship when I was 20, and I was pretty jaded with the whole lifestyle, working 60 hours a week at that age. The lifestyle was just very unhealthy, and I had an offer to work there, but I ended up turning it down just because I had a sort of a life epiphany, that this wasn't what I was. I wasn't made for this. So here I am, senior year in college, no job, no future. I worked my whole life up to basically to being an investment banker. Now I kind of threw it out the way. I threw it out the window. And so I was just trying to figure out what would be the best career move. And I thought, well, I love to write. I love English. I sort of grew up in a literary environment in all the schools that I went to. They all were pretty scholarly. So I said, why not teach English? So that's what I did. I ended up going to NYU for a graduate program, a master's degree, and that was the beginning of my career in ELT. And I've pursued doctoral studies. Haven't finished my dissertation yet, but yeah, that has brought me here. I did a little bit of teaching in the States, but that was for about 6 months, and then I came to Saudi Arabia. And I've been here ever since. I've gone back and forth to the States, but this is where I teach, and I've taught at different levels. I've taught at the primary level, and I'm also teaching at the tertiary level, and yeah, it's been quite a ride, quite interesting. A lot of things I didn't find myself doing, didn't think I would find myself doing. In terms of social justice and things like that, I find myself doing in ELT, but it is what it is. Life has its course. So that's where I am.
Right.
And in terms of academics, I try to contribute as much as I can to academia.
Okay, great. And you mentioned social justice there, and a lot of your work is
Mhm.
focused on critical issues in ELT.
Sure.
How did you come to be interested in that?
Well, I'm African American, so there are a lot of things that I guess I would say I'm sensitive to, not because I want to, but just because I've had no choice but to um, sort of have my ear on the ground and sort of be in tune with things that aren't, especially with regards to racism and discrimination, things like that. So I made a post not too long ago on Twitter. I said, I left uh, Wall Street, because I thought ELT was a relatively safe, uh, profession to join. And then when I was applying for jobs, my first time overseas, and I saw ads that were asking, for particular skin colors, and native versus non-native, and telling saying no, non-natives allowed and things like that. I was like, wow, this is really reminiscent of some of the uncomfortable things that I've just been around in life. And so I began to do a little bit of research into it and found that it was actually an issue in ELT. And I said, well, it's something that I'm passionate about, regardless of anybody's color, race, creed, um, white, black, purple, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. Everybody should have equal access to display, their talents, in the classroom, and that shouldn't be mitigated by anything. So, it became a pretty important topic for me pretty quickly. And it also became important just from personal reasons because I have lots of friends, and some of them are Arabs, and Arabs, Pakistanis, and it's disheartening to hear them, for instance, say that I'll never be able to get so and so a job because I'm not a native speaker, and they're like excellent teachers, So it became for me, sort of a personal crusade to sort of just try to make life better for other people as best I can with the academic voice that I have.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I think it's Kubota who she wrote the article about unraveling racism in a
Yep.
nice field in inverted commas. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, a lot of people go into ELT thinking that it is this kind of more egalitarian space, and I think maybe especially at the moment
Yep.
more people are waking up to the fact that it's not a lot
Right.
of the time.
Exactly. There's serious issues. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe turning to your writing a little bit. I
Sure.
think we can see this in maybe the first article that you wrote, or at least the first one that I could find,
Hmm.
was about adopting an intercultural approach to English as an international language.
Yep. Yep.
And that was in 2008, which is actually
Yeah.
the same year I started teaching myself. Um,
Oh wow. Okay.
so
Great.
Yeah. So you start the paper with a bunch of quotes from teachers which are kind of culturally insensitive or
Hmm.
chauvinistic to their learners. I was
Sure.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about those attitudes that you encountered while you were teaching, and what you kind of found problematic about those.
Yeah. So yeah, this is when again. So this is maybe 4 years after I began my teaching career, and I came to Saudi, and we had some professional development sessions, and in the sessions, some teachers, Western teachers, um, they were just going on and on about how the students, it was clear that they were condescending towards the students' culture. Saudi Arabia obviously is, it's a Muslim country, very conservative. There are many practices here that are antithetical to things that are done in the West. So and for some people, it's just difficult to deal with, and it's difficult to separate from their perspectives of the students and the country. So those things will come out during these sessions when we're talking about students and their learning styles and things like that. And then all these stereotypes just come to the table, and it seemed like the teachers were trying to use English teaching as a way to promote Western ideals in the class and in the institution, and basically say, these guys are backwards and this and that, and and for me, I was sensitive to that because, like I said, I mean, there are different approaches that countries take for English language learning. And, Saudi Arabia has been very explicit in stating that they, are very interested in the instrumental purposes of English and not necessarily, becoming Americans or becoming Canadians or British. Whereas some other countries, they do. They want, they want the cultural, so the artifacts of America and Canada, um, they want that to be a core part of their, the curriculum. So, I basically just tried to point out in that article that, it doesn't, it's fine if a country or a society or an organization, if they, if they want either or. There's bicultural approaches and there's intercultural approaches. But they, you can't by default, and this is a problem that I saw by default, expect that everybody wants to, everyone's enamored with, American culture, Western culture, and that they learn English for those purposes. And that was the reason I wanted to sort of just bring attention from a professional standpoint that, by default, you should, you would be better and you wouldn't offend people if you would adopt an intercultural approach, because yes, everybody needs English for the most part for instrumental purposes. But, in some contexts, they want it, they also want the, the cultural, the cultural artifacts. So it was just, it was just that. And, I was fortunate to get it published as my first sort of baby academic piece. I was very happy to get it published with TESOL. But yeah, it was then that I started to become, pretty passionate about these things.
Yeah, you get very similar kind of situations here in Japan as well, where you have lots of Western teachers, and I was guilty of this as well. Early in my career,
Mm-hmm.
Talking about their
Mm-hmm.
students being very passive and unable to think
Sure,
critically, and being
sure,
from this collectivist culture where they can't express
sure,
themselves and all that kind of thing.
sure,
And
sure.
people can get very kind of, if you challenge them on that, people can get very defensive. If you challenge those
Exactly,
attitudes.
exactly,
Um, did you
exactly.
encounter any defensiveness after writing that article?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, when I published it, I sort of, I'm not sure if I presented on it and like did a workshop on it for our staff. I can't remember, but yeah, I mean, people like, well, you can't deny the fact that these students need critical thinking skills, sort of same things, and you know, I mean, it was a bit of some pushback here and there, but the thing is that I just tried to get people to understand. Look, the world is a very big place, and people have different worldviews, and they have different ways. Even the way they regard knowledge and the construction of knowledge. This is something that I brought up and I'm sort of going off topic, but this is something I brought up in my plagiarism piece about how plagiarism is a very capitalistic approach to knowledge. Where ideas are commodified, and no one has the right to take your idea without referring back to you, because that commodity can become, obviously it can become lucrative. So that is something that's sort of born out of Enlightenment thinking. And but other cultures may not have the same approach to knowledge. Other cultures might have, they might, like you said, it's a collectivist society. Some may say that knowledge occupies the public domain, not the private domain. And so their ideas of plagiarism, taking someone's ideas, might be different, than ours. Not to say that they condone stealing, but their conception of taking someone's idea and using it might be very different, So if you're in a different part of the world, and you just have to be sensitive to those things. And that's basically my calling, in that paper, is just to be sensitive to the local traditions, and sort of see how you can achieve your goals, and bring the students up to, whatever objectives, to help them achieve the objectives that you have set out, but at the same time being cognizant of where they are and what they've come through, and basically respect, respect their traditions.
Right. Yeah, it's like just trying to understand why people are doing things, not just blanket condemning them
Exactly.
for doing things or assuming that they're doing
Exactly.
things, based on
Exactly.
your conception of why someone would be doing that.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Right. And I guess that there's like a movement in your work. You're focusing on critical issues, and you start with
Mhm.
with that article, which has those very kind of obvious manifestations of cultural chauvinism, those
Sure.
statements about
Sure.
the students,
Sure.
um,
Sure.
and then you also wrote about like monolingualism,
Yes.
native-speakerism, and as you just said, the plagiarism piece, where you're kind
Sure.
of getting a little bit more under the surface, finding these
Sure.
kind of slightly more hidden prejudices.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so do you see that as like um, a progression of your work over time?
Yeah, it's sort of, it's sort of progression, and I'm really trying to get at the root of some of these, as you mentioned, sort of culturally chauvinist approaches, where um, you know for instance, the monolingualism piece. This was also, I was at a university, and the administrators were very, very harsh about the use of Arabic in the class. And I kind of went along with it, obviously, because you want to conform, and you don't want to be, you don't want to buck the system and things like that. But I could see a real detriment to the students. I have the student, especially at lower levels, as I mentioned in the article. Students at lower levels, it's very difficult to make connections to the L2 when your L1 crutch has been removed, and you have no way to make sense of many, key things in the beginning of your language learning process. So, over time, trying to implement this, I said, this is not going to work, and then I started to do research and basically see that, there's no basis for it empirically anyway. And then I started to just, you just sort of hear comments in the chat, in the coffee room and things like that. Um, and it just sort of seemed like some teachers, some of the teachers were professional in their approach, and then some were just really, they just didn't want to hear Arabic, and again, it was sort of an extension of, sort of just looking down on the local culture. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, I think that this is something bigger than just, a language thing. This is, you essentially are trying to have the students check their identities at the door. And that to me is something that's to me, that wasn't acceptable. So I said, we have to sort of, analyze these things. And but the thing is that, obviously, I come from the West, I come from America, and I come from a literary tradition. So you have to, make substantial, arguments that are substantiated, and and they have to make sense. So I said, tackling this idea of monolingualism from the standpoint that it removes linguistic crutches for students, hopefully, okay, if you don't accept the fact that, I mean, and I also did mention that you're asking to students to check their identities at the door, but, hopefully, if you don't accept that argument, at least from a linguistic standpoint, and also, the fact that there's no empirical evidence that supports that, hopefully people will be able to accept, at the very least, that, yeah, it's not the best policy to be using. um, and it's more destructive than it's constructive. So yeah, I mean, I've tried to be a little bit more analytical in my work, and then also, these kind of articles with Oxford, and these longer articles allowed me, to be a little bit, like I said, a little bit more analytical, give me more space to really investigate these issues.
Hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, in terms of those monolingual kind of policies,
Mm-hmm.
where were they coming from? Because the monolingualism is often talked about in terms of kind of Western teachers, as you mentioned, maybe not wanting to hear the student's language, or maybe there's this kind of misplaced idea that it's better for learning or whatever. But in my
Mm-hmm.
experience, in Japan at least, monolingual policies are often enforced by the Japanese staff or by the institution itself rather than the
Right.
Western teachers.
Right.
How about in your case?
Well, this is the thing. Yes. So the policies would be instituted by the administration. So our director would say the policy is no Arabic, but who would enforce it? That would be clear. So you'd have some Western teachers that would enforce it, and then you have some Western teachers that are sensitive to the needs of the students, and they wouldn't. Um, but you would never find Arab teachers enforcing it that much because they sort of, I guess, intuitively they knew what the language learning process would look like. So, they wouldn't. For them, it would be sort of impossible to ask their students to do something that they themselves, it was impossible for them to do. Um, so yeah, so no, it wasn't necessarily that Western teachers took it upon themselves to come up with the policy, but the level of enforcement, ranged. And of all the teaching staff, Western, non-Western, it was Western teachers that would enforce it. And, oftentimes it seemed like, I mean, well, I can't say oftentimes because I don't have any empirical, investigation of it, but from some of the comments that I would hear in the staff, because I was also an administrator at the time, so I had to check up on teachers a lot. I had to observe, I had to make observations, and so in the class, a student would be talking Arabic, and the teacher would basically like, no Arabic, we don't want Arabic in the class, and it was sort of a militant approach to the use of Arabic when to me that wasn't very constructive. That wasn't very constructive at all. So I saw various approaches to the enforcement, and the overall picture I got was that too many people had a wrong idea about the the policy, and they sort of enforced it in ways that were not constructive for the students.
Yeah. I think we've had similar experiences there.
Yeah, yeah,
In the book that I sent you, I talk about a program where I was working where there was a very strict English only policy, but the teachers didn't always follow it. But then in the tests the students had to do, they
right.
lost a point for every Japanese word they used.
Well,
So yeah, like very, very strict. And
right,
again,
right.
there was no empirical reason for it. It was all just,
Sure,
like, well, it sounds good to the parents.
sure, sure,
Um,
sure, sure, sure. I mean, for me, I mean, if I understand that, I understand the principle that yes, you're here to learn English, so you should speak, English, maximize your opportunities in the classroom to speak English. Yeah, I get that, and you definitely, there were moments, in class when the student would rely too much on the L1, and I think that's also not constructive. When students relied too much on the crutches and weren't willing to explore or make mistakes in the L2, that I thought was not helpful. So I mean, there is some benefit to restricting the use, of L1. But again, when at lower levels, I think that restriction should be a lot, it should be a lot more lenient. It shouldn't be as stringent. Um, and then also, at the end of the day, a student should be able to refer to their L1 if they find themselves in a linguistic problem. I asked my I
mm,
asked I asked the same staff. I say, okay, you are so adamant about not using L1. I would love for you to learn Russian or Chinese and not use any English. I would love that. And they look at me like,
yeah,
it's like, yeah, now you see. Try to do what you're asking the students to do, you know?
yeah. I think ideally it would be negotiated with the students, right? You can come up with,
Exactly.
a set of criteria when you both agree it's okay for them to use the L1, and when you both agree that it would be better to focus on English, and then you can base your classroom policy and teaching around that.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a
Yep.
lot of these things come out of teachers not having a dialogue with their students. Um,
Sure. Sort of top down, approaches.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and related to that, I mentioned before you had a comment piece about native speakerism in ELT Journal.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Hmm.
so Is that something you've experienced yourself? I mean, obviously, native speakerism is to some extent a linguistically based thing,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of research that's
Mhm.
also based on things like race and class and nationality and all that kind of thing.
Sure,
Um,
sure, sure.
is Yeah, I mean, how did you get interested in that? Was that a personal thing, or was it something more that you just
Yeah.
sort of?
It's really interesting because, yeah, as you mentioned, native speakerism is, supposed to be a linguistic thing. But in my experience, for one, it was, I just saw in the beginning, before I really delved into the issue, I really just saw that it wasn't there was something funny and strange about the idea that, okay, if you're a native speaker, you automatically the best, you are linguistically superior, you're the one who can, sort of help the students internalize, the cultural nuances of the language and things like this. And I bought into it for a little bit, and then, after a while I said, well, wait a minute, time out. English is a global language. It's not like Indian, Hindi language, where you can only speak it in India. It's not like Russian, where you can only speak Russian in Russia. It's not like all these other languages where it's really, those languages are really relegated to the place. So you have to know, it's better to be taught by someone, native to the country, because um, perhaps other people who teach it might not have, the sort of the cultural nuances that are, very, important to the language. But something as global as English, where you might have somebody from Nigeria or somebody from China, and they are having a business dealing, and they're speaking in English, sort of what is the purpose of a native speaker, in that regard, what connection does this Nigerian man and this, Chinese person, what connection do they have to anything in native speaking countries? So I started to see that, there's something, there's some inconsistencies here, and and then also, again, like I said, with my experiences of my, the teaching staff, I've been very fortunate to assume administrative positions pretty much everywhere I've gone. So I've been, responsible for, teacher training, teacher observations, things like this, and it's always, and I say this with quote, inverted commas, and actually I call for, in one of my tweets, I said we need to bring, and I think you mentioned it, one of your articles or a few of your articles. You say so-called, so-called native speaker and so-called native non-native speaker. I think that that's really
Hmm.
important, that we need to, because it goes beyond just symbols. Okay, inverted commas is okay, but to me, we need to, actively challenge the fact that these constructs, native speaker and non-native, they really don't mean anything, um,
Mm.
in reality. So yeah, so I would, you know, uh, talk to the so-called, non-native speakers, and there's no problem with their intelligibility, their accents. There's no problems with their methodology, and I looked at their teaching styles, and I looked, observed them in class. And if anything, in many cases, their classes were more engaging and more productive than some of the so-called not, the so-called native speakers. So I was like, no, this is, just because someone is quote unquote, so-called native speaker, that shouldn't have a, premium currency in the industry. And so for me, it began sort of a discriminatory thing. Like, why are we so, why do, so-called non-native speakers have such a low, they're regarded so lowly in the field, when, I myself have observed that they are, very competent, very knowledgeable, and, so for me, it became a, it was a bit personal, but yeah, it's just, it was just an injustice that I couldn't be silent about. And then, it became personal when, there's this issue of, and I think you mentioned it as well, but other scholars have called attention to it, what's called perceived native speakerism. So here I am thinking that I'm supposed to benefit from this uh, ideology. Okay, I'm from America. We get the higher salaries, and blah 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 blah. But at the same time that I'm supposed to quote unquote benefit from this ideology, I have also been a victim of it. Because I would apply for jobs, or I'd be at interviews, and the first question that I would get is, "Are you really a native speaker? I know that you're
Right.
a citizen, but are you really?" And I'm looking at him like, "What the? Are you like what? Excuse me? My last name is Jenkins. My middle name is Andre. I don't. The first country I worked in and lived in is Saudi Arabia. After. So what do you mean? Am I really a native speaker? So then I was like, oh, wait a minute. So this issue of native speaker is not just a linguistic thing. It's not about just okay the language and things like that. I speak fluent, flawless English. What are you guys talking about? Am I a native? Not am I a native speaker or not? So then I started to investigate that. There are these other intersectionalities of with native speakers, and that it's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's just a reality. And at the end of the day, I know how I felt when my talents, my passion for the field was reduced to just skin color or name or things like that. And I think that obviously these things have no place in any profession. But definitely something like teaching and learning was such a noble profession. Teaching and learning is an amazing process. And if you push all the foolish things to the side, it's just a beautiful thing to teach and learn and have an impact in the student's life. The fact that somebody could be prevented from doing that based on these superficial factors really irks me. So I said, that's it. That's my calling. I have to jump in the pan and sort of do my part wherever I can. And I think it's my perspective is a bit different, because yeah, I mean, like yourself, um, for me, it's a beautiful thing when native speakers, when they are the ones that are sort of fighting for this issue of native-speakerism. They're fighting against it. They're saying that it's not the right thing to do. And that is, to me, that's commendable and that's amazing. I don't know, and I know that there are other scholars of color, but I don't know of any and I'd have to check. I don't know any black scholars. So I think
Mm.
that my perspective is novel, and I think that it's necessary, to sort of give my, perspective on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for us kind of uh, native speakers, it's almost the
Mhm.
minimum that we can do, right? Is to speak out.
Sure,
Um,
sure,
but
sure,
I've always felt very uncomfortable about it as well because
sure,
I'm someone who's benefited from basically every type of privilege. And
sure,
in my
sure, sure,
articles, there's a lot of talk about citation practice, citation being a political act.
sure,
Um,
sure,
and I'm aware that a lot of the people I cite have also benefited from a lot of these privileges, and it is great to have
sure,
people from from your background and various other backgrounds
sure,
who can bring new perspectives and maybe more kind of authentic or
sure,
personal perspectives to the topic. Yeah, I think that's really
sure,
important.
sure, sure, sure,
Yeah.
sure. And like I said, I don't, for me, I would feel it would be academic negligence, for me to sort of just sit back and collect a paycheck and benefit, like you said, from, being a so-called native speaker, but, having these issues, out there and not doing my part to try to bring attention to them. I think that would be, negligence, on my part. So I have no choice.
Yeah. Well, speaking of
As
intersections, oh, awesome.
mhm.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, no. As I mean, as uncomfortable as it is, it's not comfortable to to talk about these things, and I don't enjoy it. It's something that just like in general, just racism in society, discrimination in society, any type of it's just not a comfortable. It's not a pleasant thing to talk about. But unfortunately, it is what it is, and sometimes you just have to take the bull by the horns, and I try to be diplomatic. I try to be, I don't want to be antagonistic in any way, but at the same time, there are, some critical issues that just, as uncomfortable as they are, they just have to be addressed. So, you know,
Yeah, and a lot of reactions to addressing these kinds of issues can be quite reactionary. So as I
Yeah,
mentioned
sure,
earlier, I sent you a copy of my new book, and I posted about that
sure,
on LinkedIn, like just a photo of it, and someone
sure.
commented hashtag cultural Marxism,
Wow.
which
Wow. Wow. Okay. Yep. Well, there you go. You can't please all
yeah,
the people
yeah,
all the time.
just based on the cover, just on the title.
Just on the cover.
No,
Yep. It is what it is.
yeah,
Yeah. Sorry about that. What were you gonna say?
yeah. I was going to say so. Yeah, but you mentioned intersections, and
Sure.
I've been reading through your articles, and also you very kindly sent me a sort of pre-release copy of your upcoming book,
Sure.
and one theme that was running through it was Islam, and
Sure.
I was kind of interested in talking about that a little bit,
Sure.
uh, particularly in terms of these kind of intersections. First of all, do you see much of a relationship between like your faith and your teaching? How does the one influence the other? What's the
Oh,
relationship
that's
there?
interesting. I mean, really, yeah, there's sort of compartmentalized. And there's no real overlap. I mean, in the Middle East, there'll be a greater overlap because there are, for instance, in class, if there are certain examples, linguistic examples that I would bring, I can sort of relate them to the L1, or there's certain cultural practices that they may not be familiar with. In the West, like Halloween, they have no concept of what that means. But I can bring sort of a festivity or a holiday in the L1 or in Islam that they would be more comfortable with or more cognizant of. So it plays that role, but other than that, no, it's not really because I taught before in the U.S. and it was sort of like okay, yeah, we're all different, and it was
Mm.
it was all good.
Right, right. The reason I ask is because your academic work is positioned within kind of critical ELT or critical applied
Sure,
linguistics,
sure,
um, and there's been quite a lot of discourse in critical applied linguistics. I'm
hmm,
thinking particularly of people like Julian Edge,
sure,
kind of highlighting the tensions between critical applied linguistics and kind of Christian, kind of missionary
sure,
um, language teachers.
sure,
And I think that's a very interesting conversation. But
sure,
I've always felt there's sort of this that juxtaposition between the two, as if there was like some kind of inherent clash between kind of faith and taking a critical approach.
sure.
Um, yeah, I was wondering what your perspective is on that, because
Yeah,
you're sort of in both camps.
right, sure.
Not they're
Yeah,
not
that's
really camps, but
right, right, right. I mean, the thing is I mean, um, the religion, it talks about, fighting against injustice, fighting against oppression. It's something that's looked down upon. Um, so, for me, it's not an oxymoron to be, to be, um, a Muslim in ELT, and teaching English, over the world, and also fighting against the things that are not appropriate. Like you said before, there are linguistic and economic and professional benefits to learning the language, English, and that helps students get ahead in their lives. Yeah, sure. I mean, there's one article I read a long time ago in TESOL Quarterly. I forget the title, but basically it's talking about, yeah, we're not missionaries with English trying to go abroad and sort of indoctrinate students into American culture, Western culture, and then also religious wise, teaching Christian morals and things like that. I mean, sure, you might have that. Have a strain of professionals in ELT professionals who think that way, and that would be unfortunate. But I think those types of teachers in the minority. I think most teachers, um, they really are trying to do their job as teaching the language. But for me, it's more, it would be more of a sort of a cultural, sort of a cultural chauvinism that you would see from professionals when it comes to teaching English. More, the British are the best. The Canadian culture is best. American culture is best. And yeah, some of those things are obviously tied to Christianity, but that tension, I don't myself personally, I don't see it as that flagrant where I would need to call attention to it. Now, I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure it manifests its way, it manifests itself in sort of subtle ways. But I myself, I haven't encountered that. So yeah, so I wouldn't, I haven't, it hasn't been brought to my attention, and so I wouldn't be able to say that there's that tension is really that strong. But again, it might be in other cases, and it might, I'm sure there's literature out there that supports that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's maybe something that critical applied linguistics or critical ELT. It's maybe a bit
Mhm.
of a prejudice there that needs to be addressed. Yeah, even
Sure,
within the
sure, sure,
critical literature, there are still these kind of hidden prejudices,
sure,
right?
sure, sure. I think
Um,
one
and
scholar, Suhail Karmani, he began to broach the topic with a few articles back in 2006, like right after 9/11, and he was talking about the position of Islam and ELT and things like that. But I don't think anybody else sort of pursued it. Yeah, I don't think anybody else pursued it, and he kind of just sort of
mm,
he kind of fell off. So
yeah, yeah. Well, I think maybe
mhm.
it's an area that more people should be writing about, and it's something that
Absolutely,
you have written about recently, right?
yes,
So you've
yes, yep,
just published an article which was a study of two African American Muslim teachers working in Saudi
yep,
Arabia.
yep,
Um,
yep,
yeah,
hmm,
and you talk about a conundrum that those teachers
hmm,
face.
right.
On kind of religious and racial grounds. I was wondering if you could explain that conundrum and just elaborate on it a little bit.
Sure. Yes. So this was a very this was a very interesting and personal study for me because you know being a native speaker, okay, that has obviously that has it has connotations, right? So you're a native speaker from the U.S. Generally, students don't equate that with being African American, with all the prominent African Americans, comedy and sports and athletes and things like this, politicians. For some reason, that just doesn't, that just doesn't in this part of the world, in the Middle East. And then add on top of that that they don't expect an American to be a Muslim. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to sort of see how does that play out in the classroom, how does that play out in basically in the society that these African American Muslim teachers were teaching in. And they were the subjects of the study, but it was sort of from a researcher positionality standpoint, I was sort of with them, because I've experienced many of the same things. So basically in that article, I just wanted to highlight the fact that not only do native speakers, not only it's not one monolith. They're, a native speaker is not, they're very different types of native speakers, and one of the two main ways in which they can be broken down further is examining the intersectionality between race and religion. So when you find a native speaker who is African American and Muslim, their experiences were very, very interesting in the way that they were perceived. Like for instance, with regards to cultural capital, students sort of gravitate to some of the things that are popular in African American culture, and so they would be perceived sort of as cool and hip and all these other things. But from an administrative standpoint, African American teachers were not perceived as being as qualified as, white American or native speakers. So and this was some of these are some of the things that these the subjects of the study they express. So in some ways we're welcome, in other ways we're not, and it's just it's interesting to be both at the same time. For them, for the African American teachers, being a Muslim, and coming to a place where they can learn Arabic, for them that was they saw that as an opportunity, for them to gain linguistic currency that will help them understand their religion better, help them identify with their religion better. But at the same time, the moment that they try to speak and practice Arabic in the streets, immediately they're perceived as, so-called non-native speakers. Like, it's impossible for an American to know Arabic, so you must not be originally from America. You must be, from some, an African country or from an Arab country. And now, so it was really, really interesting to see all these dynamics at play, based on, clothing that was worn, or, language that was used. And I just tried to highlight those things in the article.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting article. And I think that, native speakerism research, it has been focused very much on, the kind of the linguistic. And there's been like this
Sure.
growing recognition of, different intersections. So, people have talked about, race and native speakerism, and gender and native speakerism,
Sure.
and nationality and native speakerism.
Sure.
But I think
Sure.
that, that's the direction the research is moving, looking at all of these intersections
Right.
between different aspects
Exactly.
of people's identities. And that's really
Exactly.
fruitful, I think, as your article shows.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. Yep.
So I think we're coming towards the end of the interview. As I mentioned earlier,
Sure.
you have a book coming out soon, not about ELT, but
Yes.
I was wondering if you'd like to take a couple of minutes to promote it.
Sure. Yeah, I took a hiatus off of publishing. The article you talked about was published at the end of last year, and I have not been able to put anything out this year. Unfortunately, I will start. I promise. I'll try to have something out by the end of the year. But that was because I was working on a book, and the book is a biographical memoir about a good friend of mine. His name is Mutah Beale, and he was a former rapper with Tupac Shakur, and he had an unbelievable life. Beginning with the murder of his parents, at 3 years old, and then just basically trying to navigate life in America at a time when drugs hit inner cities and things like that. So his life is just a cascade of tragedy. It's a tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, death after death after death, and then he emerges from this to become a relatively mentally healthy, sane and productive individual. And it's just an amazing story of resilience. And the thing is, though, is that obviously I'm an academic, so and rap and hip hop and these things, then obviously they're not associated with that sort of the sort of associated with sort of destructive things like killing and misogyny and sort of lowly things. But my approach to his story, I told him from the beginning, is look, it has to be an academic piece, because that's what I am, and I can't. We need to present your story in a way that would be, I think it would be enjoyed, and I think it would be respected. If we can sort of tie your life into major events that happen, in American society, core themes that affected, African American society, like our African American community, like police brutality. If we can tie in things that have been sensitive but not really talked about so much in African American community, like mental health, and then also obviously, from a academic standpoint, obviously you cite and you source everything, so this biography is, and it's a memoir. It won't be, no one can accuse him of basically it's just his account of things. No, you can cross-reference everything. We use about 150 sources, from different interviews, and magazines and books, reputable, sources and things like that. So, I think it's going to be a novel um, approach to a biography about somebody. It's very similar in terms of spirit to the autobiography of Malcolm X, but it's very different in terms of the approach. Because we integrate both our voices. He uses narrations, and then I go ahead as a biographer. I paint a story and a narrative. So yeah, check it out. I think it'll be very refreshing, and it's supposed to be released in the middle of the month of this month, but we at the last minute we've been picked up by a publisher, so details of the actual release will be forthcoming.
Okay. Do you want to give the title?
Yeah, the title is Life is Raw, the story of a reformed outlaw. So check it out.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Yeah. As I said, you sent me an advanced copy, and I've read about 3/4 of the way through, and I think I'm just getting to the kind of the turnaround point. I really recommend it. I think anyone who's interested in that world, or people like me who know nothing about rap, or that's a completely different world.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's I'm very happy that you said that. And I'm very, I'm very. It's very refreshing because, for me, in writing the book, that was my intention. My intention, you have to look at, obviously, as an author, you have to look at who's the audience. And for me, I really wanted it to be a book that can be read by anybody. You don't necessarily have to be Black or American or Muslim or, interested in hip hop or know anything about it. It is a text that you can go to and you can learn. If you don't know anything about any of these things, you can learn, and hopefully, after reading the book, you will gain appreciation at the very least. So I'm very happy that it's had that effect on you.
Yeah. Great.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll finish things there. So, Solomon, thank you very much for joining us.
You too. Thank you very much, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so thank you everyone for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we'd also like to say thank you to Sulaiman Jenkins for taking part. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us and message us on Twitter at TEFLology, and we also have a Facebook page and a YouTube page. Our website, TEFLology-podcast.com, contains all of our previous episodes, and we would encourage you to subscribe through your podcast provider. So thank you very much for listening to our podcast, and we'll see you all again soon.